Okay, I would like to welcome you all to the conference of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. This is a particular conference to the Arab graduate students in Western universities, which is a very important forum for all of us. This particular session is on the theme of linguistics, with particular reference to the teaching aspects of it in the context of applied linguistics. Our speaker in this session is Ms. Nagham Jaafar Majeed, and that was her title at the time she submitted the abstract for presentation at this conference. Now I'm pleased to report to everybody that Ms. Majeed has just completed her PhD. So I would like to, on your behalf, to congratulate her and wish her a very bright future in her future endeavors. Dr. Majeed has a presentation to us today on the comparative study of two models to present phrasal verbs, which is some topic of hot debate in the field of teaching, and with particular reference to teaching foreign students in their native environment of the language. Dr. Majeed completed her PhD in teaching English to speakers of other languages, TESOL, at the University of Central Florida. She holds a master's degree in linguistics from the College of Education at the Alaa University in Iraq. Dr. Majeed formerly also worked as a language instructor with the English Language Institute at the University of Central Florida, and has published an article on building vocabulary through affixes in Al-Ustadh journal in Baghdad, which is quite a distinguished publication. I would like to invite Dr. Majeed to give us her presentation, where she has a bit of time, and I know that she has prepared an interesting power presentation for us. Her presentation will then be followed by brief comments from me as the discussant of the panel, and then we'll open the floor for questions either from the panelists or from the audience at large. So Dr. Majeed, without much ado, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alaa. And again, my name is Nagham Jaafar Majeed. I've just completed my PhD from University of Central Florida. And the title of my dissertation is A Comparative Study of Two Models of Presenting Phrasal Verbs. So first, let us define phrasal verbs. The phrasal verb consists of two words or three words. The first word is a verb, the second one is a particle, and the third one, if it exists, is a preposition. For example, we have turn in, fill out, look after, and give up. In my study, I've concentrated on only two particles. They are in and out. In some, the combination of verb plus particle is called a phrasal verb. So the two models that were used in this study are the traditional model and the container metaphor model. The traditional model of teaching phrasal verbs implies that phrasal verbs are non-conditional, meaning that their meaning cannot be predicted from their constituents. I mean, from the two parts, the verb and the particles. Therefore, according to the traditional model, phrasal verbs are idiomatic expressions. So we have two phrasal verbs. Therefore, the teachers followed the traditional model, provide their students with a list of phrasal verbs along with their meanings, sometimes with the translation to the first language, and then they ask their students to memorize this list of phrasal verbs. By doing this, students might feel, some students might feel frustrated because they cannot use their knowledge, their previous knowledge about the meaning of the verb and the particle meaning. Therefore, there was an urgent need to develop more effective method to use it in presenting and teaching phrasal verbs. So the researcher found that there are two kinds of conceptual metaphors that can be used in teaching and presenting phrasal verbs. And these are the orientational metaphor and the container metaphor. Actually, many studies, I found many studies that compared the orientational metaphor with the traditional model. However, little to no research has addressed the difference between the container metaphor model and the traditional model of presenting phrasal verbs. Therefore, I have selected the container metaphor as the second model of my study. Therefore, the idea of studying the new metaphorical container model of presenting phrasal verbs stemmed from the gap found in the literature review. So the research question of my study is there a significant difference in ESL student success rate of learning phrasal verbs between a traditional model and the container metaphor model of presentation? I will talk about the methodology used in the study. So this study followed a quantitative comparative research method utilizing a non-randomized experimental design following a pre-test and 3 post-tests, post-test 1, post-test 2, and post-test 3 sequence. And the sample of my study, there were 2 groups of this study. The first one is the control group that followed the traditional model, and the second group followed the container metaphor model. And there were 28 intermediate level students, and their ages were between the 18 and 35. Also, there were no students with a Germanic language background, and this point is important because phrasal verbs exist in Germanic languages but do not occur in Romance languages. So the students in this study reported only 5 languages. These languages were Arabic, Turkish, Spanish, Portuguese, and Chinese. For the data collection procedures, after IRB approval was obtained, a pilot test consisting of 18 phrasal verbs was administered on advanced level students. Although this study concentrated on intermediate level students, it was anticipated that phrasal verbs that are unknown to higher level students are likely to be also unknown to intermediate level students. Therefore, advanced level students were selected to take the pilot test. And these are the 18 phrasal verbs that are used in the pilot test. And why these specific 18 phrasal verbs? Actually, I selected these 18 phrasal verbs for 2 important reasons. The first one is these phrasal verbs are of infrequent occurrence. And second, they are easily illustrated by the container metaphor model. So all the phrasal verbs with high means were excluded from the pre-test, post-test 1, 2, and 3. So join in, hand out, step in, and drop out, bring out, and finally kick in were excluded from the coming test. Why? Because they are of high means, and we need just the phrasal verbs that are difficult. Presenting and teaching the 16 phrasal verbs for both the group, control and experimental group. So day one was about the consent form and the pretest. So 3 days before the presentation day, the consent form and the pretest were given to the control group and to the experimental group. They were given to the control group during their second class, while for the experimental group, they were given in their third class. Short introduction about the research and about phrasal verbs also was presented. And the consent form was read, and the researcher made sure that the students understood the information or the contents of the consent. Also, the researcher told the students that dictionary was not allowed during taking the pretest. So the pretest was given, and the researcher told the students to match the 16 phrasal verbs from A to B column. Presentation practice production, or what is called PPP approach, was used in this study. So P1 stands for presentation, P2 for practice, and P3 for production. And actually, the procedures of teaching phrasal verbs was exactly the same, except for the P1, the presentation. So the P1 was the only step that was different from the other steps. Day 2 included PPP lesson and post-test 1. So at P1, the 16 phrasal verbs were introduced to both groups. And also, it was very important to control for time on task and to get the students, the researchers and the students in both the group, control group and experimental group, to spend about the same amount of time learning each phrasal verb. In order to do that, the researcher converted the PPP slide into video, the PowerPoint slides into video recordings that have audio narrations. Therefore, the first video was to the control group, while the second video was to the experimental group. The researcher was the instructor for both the groups, and the students were informed that they would watch a PowerPoint video recording in which 16 phrasal verbs would be presented. Also, the students were informed that questions were not allowed during the presentation. However, if they have any question, they could write down their questions, and then the teachers would answer them at the end of the presentation. Presenting the 16 phrasal verbs for the control group was in this way. For example, we have the phrasal verb turn in. So the researcher gives the definitions or gave the definition to the phrasal verb turn in as to go to bed or to go to sleep. Examples were provided as well. For example, well, I think I will turn in now because I have to get up early tomorrow. While the same phrasal verbs, which is turn in, was presented in this way. The researcher told the students that let us consider the bed as a container. So if she turns in the bed, which is the container, that means she goes to bed or she goes to sleep. Same examples were provided to the experimental group. Another example is figure out. And in this case, we will consider the problem is a container. So if you figure out of the container, which is the problem, that means you find the answer to a question or to a problem. And actually, all the containers, the researcher told the students that all the containers will be in red color boundaries. And this is the handout corresponding to the control group. This is only screenshot for some of the phrasal verbs. So first we have a list of phrasal verbs together with their meanings and examples. While the handout for the experimental group, we have also a list of phrasal verbs, the same list, but here we have additional column, which is the container metaphor. So we have the name of the containers with the figures, and then meaning and examples. After the handout, which were given to students in order to consult, post-test 1 was given to both groups in order to see if there is an improvement between the pre-test and post-test. After post-test 1, practice and production, we have P2. So students were given some exercises to practice what they had already learned. While in P3, or in the production, participants were encouraged to work in group of 3 students to use what they had already learned in P1 and P2. The 16 phrasal verbs were presented for the control and experimental group in two different ways as shown in this table. So we have the phrasal verb for the control group, while we have phrasal verb with the name of the container to the experimental group. And then definition for both of the groups. We have the traditional definition of barge in, while to the experimental group, the definition was according to the container metaphor. Figures are provided as well. Same with dive in. For example, dive in was defined for the traditional group as to start doing something very eagerly, especially without stopping to think before you do it. While to the experimental group, the researcher told the students to consider, to imagine that the book or a project is a container. So if you dive in the container, which is the project, that means you start to do something very eagerly. In day 3, post-test 2, was conducted after the PPP lesson to examine participants' improvement after P2 and P3. And day 4, post-test 3 was administered, and that was 1 week later. And here is the description for the all tests that were administered over the course of this study. So we have 5 tests. The first one was the pilot test, which was taken by advanced level students, and they were 18 phrasal verbs, and all these 18 phrasal verbs were infrequent. And then for the intermediate level student, which is the sample of this study, we have a pre-test, post-test 1 and post-test 2. They were exactly the same. They have 16 phrasal verbs, which were taken from the 18 phrasal verbs plus 12 plus 4 frequent phrasal verbs, as well as I will explain. Post-test 3 consisted of 22 phrasal verbs, and these phrasal verbs are the 16 taught phrasal verbs plus 6 untaught phrasal verbs. An independent sample t-test was run in order to see if there was statistically significant difference between the control and the experimental group. And the result showed that there was no statistically significant difference between the control and the experimental group, since the mean for the control group was 493, and for the experimental group was 457, and we are okay with this group. Also, the results confirmed that the difficulty of the 12 phrasal verbs extracted from the pilot test. So this also was a confirmation that the whole 12 phrasal verbs are really difficult. Here, the results showed that experimental group were better than the control group in post-test 1. So there is a statistically significant difference between these two groups. Also in post-test 2, there was statistically significant difference between the control and the experimental group. Same result or similar result in post-test 3. Also, experimental group were better than the control group. I will mention some of the implications of my study. It is vital to include the container metaphor model as an alternative method or model of presenting phrasal verbs that are associated with the particle out and in. The result of the current study demonstrated the importance of depending on empirical evidence to design images, because images were really important. Since the phrasal verbs depend heavily on the conceptual framework, ESL teachers first need to know about the container metaphor, and then they teach phrasal verbs explicitly. So this study provided further indication of the importance of the explicit teaching of phrasal verb under the container metaphor model of intermediate level students. Finally, second language students depend upon a small number of highly frequented phrasal verbs. However, they have a difficulty with the phrasal verb in the low frequency band because the researcher found that all the previous research concentrated only on the frequent phrasal verbs. Therefore, researchers were recommended including infrequent phrasal verbs in their research in addition to the frequent ones. As usual, there are some limitations of the study, but the most significant one was the small size of the sample, because the sample consisted of only 28 students, and that was because at that time was summer, so I couldn't find a larger sample. And the particles used were only in and out, and selecting the particles also concentrated on the metaphor or the kind of metaphor used, which is the container metaphor model. Also, the list of the 16 phrasal verbs didn't include the various meaning of the polysemous phrasal verbs, and actually we did that on purpose because we needed only the difficult meaning of the phrasal verbs. The current research focused on provided quantitative data, leaving out the qualitative exploration. For future studies, this container metaphor model can be used in the presenting and teaching not only phrasal verbs, but also other idiomatic items such as proverbs. This study can be replicated by investigating the difficulties that face students from two different languages and see if first language background can affect the results. So one of the studies might be comparing two groups, one group with phrasal verbs background, while the other one maybe with a non-Germanic language. In conclusion, on the whole, the aim of the study, which was evaluating the effect of the container metaphor comparing the traditional model in the presenting phrasal verbs, was achieved. And quantitative comparative analysis of a sequence of 4 tests revealed that intermediate level students who followed the container metaphor model, which used image schemas as a way of presenting phrasal verbs, was significantly better than the traditional model that relies mainly on memorization in both learning and retaining the phrasal verbs. And that's it.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Majeed, for this very succinct presentation of the topic, the methodology, the steps taken to go through it, and then finally the conclusion.
Thank you.
I would like to begin my comments, which I will try to keep brief, to a number of things. First, I would like to commend you on your selection of topic and your veering towards the quantitative analysis of the data, both in terms of the collection and in terms of the conclusion, the conclusions to which you reached. Your presentation actually raises a number of major questions. Most of them touch upon the concepts and the theories. And if you would permit me, I would like to begin with very specific suggestions for the paper when it finally goes to publication. And then I would like to open up the floor with comments about the concept as such. So if I may, in the beginning, suggest that the paper, as I saw it, I think will benefit by an explicit definition of a number of terms and basic concepts that you introduce. The first one is the traditional model, which you refer to frequently as the one that relies on translation and memorization. But I think there is more to probably the term traditional than just translation. I mean, that's a very old way to think of tradition. There has been, since that, a number of models that have also become now classical and traditional. So I think you may want to just look at the term and try to come up with a definition as you would like to see it, and as it would probably benefit future research in the field. The same thing applies to the other terms. You, of course, rely on the conceptual metaphor model. But I think because you're so close to the terminology and to the material, you forgot to define them for the purposes of the paper. So I would suggest that you define both the conceptual metaphor models in the two modalities that you mentioned, both the orientational and the container. You jump right into, I don't know if you would consider that a phrasal verb or not, but you jump right into the discussion, and I think it would benefit the paper and the reader to have the definition so we are on the same page with you in the way you use these terms. Now, if you permit me, I would like to move on to the general theoretical issues that your paper very interestingly raises. The first category is the category of methodology. When you talk about how you went about selecting the phrasal verbs, you listed a number of criteria. One of them, or salient among them, was the criteria of frequency, which is a very controversial criterion to begin with, because how do we define frequency? Do we define frequency by usage, by, for example, big data mining and this kind of research? Or do we define frequency by how often it occurs in a dictionary? I mean, it's very problematic. And also, I think oftentimes the term frequency can be confused or confluenced with the term functional load. Because as you know, when we approach a topic of linguistics and we try to deal with categories, we always try to isolate the functional load of whatever it is that we're working with, whether it's an item of vocabulary or lexicon, or whether it's a grammatical category, and we try to determine how much weight and function it carries in the language and how often it's used. So the term frequency, I think, is something that may deserve some discussion in your paper, simply because it's very interesting. And I think your reader would be interested to approach how you see these in your paper. The second point under methodology, which I found really intriguing because it just opens up so many research questions for other researchers and for the future, is you mention in the paper that you made an assumption that you will, in your selection of the phrasal verbs, that you will administer some kind of test for the advanced students first, and then the items that are problematic for this category of students would be the items that you select for everybody else. There, I think one has to be a bit careful, because when one thinks that these students are in the native environment of the language, they're in the United States, they're not in Egypt or Iraq or Syria, and therefore their exposure to the language is not controlled. The classroom is not the only source of exposure to the language, and therefore the traditional model of a student going into a classroom and moving gradually up from level 1 to level 2 to level 3, where this is the only source of information, could be a little bit, I think, problematic. So there, I mean, look, I don't really know. You may be absolutely right in making that assumption, but I would just probably approach it more hesitantly. The third point about the methodology is, in your presentation just now, you mentioned that you steered away from Germanic languages simply because Germanic languages have this category of phrasal verbs. And therefore, you wanted to steer away from that. In the paper, I don't think you mentioned the language backgrounds of your group, but you've mentioned them just now in the presentation. I think you referred to Arabic, Spanish, Portuguese, and 2 other languages. And this really opens up the door for a very interesting theoretical question, which started in the late 50s, but still has not disappeared, which is the issue of transfer. So by the mere exclusion of a particular language group, you are basically implying that you accept the notion of transfer and you're trying to eliminate the adverse effect of that notion, and it's fine. If I were you, I would probably bring it up in the paper and just as an additional justification for why I would want to exclude a particular language group, from the whole discussion. It would just make it that much clearer to the reader. And then my last category, which again your paper very interestingly raises, is you refer to the triple P, which of course is a very interesting model of testing whether a particular group has learned a particular structure or not. But there, I think there's some kind of maybe, I don't know, one can fall into a paradox here, and I'll share with you why. The presentation basically argues that phrasal verbs are best presented as not as idiomatics, right? In other words, they're not lumps, they can be analyzed. And because they can be analyzed, then they allow us to manipulate them in different ways and subject them to different teaching and learning models, which is fine, and I completely agree with you. However, there's also the notion of learning as a cognitive process and as a developmental process. In other words, I may learn the meaning of a particular particle, as in this case, or a particular preposition, and I can learn to link the meaning of that particle with a particular verb or a set of verbs, okay? But the real test of learning as such is really if I end up formulating a rule and then using this rule to deal with other data to extract meaning, you see? And that is, I think, where your study really, really opens up the door for very interesting theoretical questions that really need to be addressed in future studies, either by you or by future researchers. I would like to end my remarks by commending the work you have done. You have done an excellent work. Your paper raises very interesting questions. It's obvious that no one paper or even book or study can answer can answer all these questions, but yours has certainly raised a lot of them. And I would like to thank you again for your paper and for your presentation. And I would like to invite the participants who are with us in the panel to please feel free to submit questions to Dr. Majeed, who of course is also free to address some of the issues I've raised if she wishes to now or in the course of the discussions. So please, I invite everybody to submit the questions if they would like to. Any comments or questions? Okay, maybe Dr. Majeed, maybe you can address some of the issues if you would like that were raised. Your mic is off. You need to turn your mic on. Okay.
Sorry. So for the definitions, Dr. Alaa, of course, I mentioned these definitions in the dissertation, not in the research paper, because, you know, I tried to give only the summary. So I, of course, define the conceptual metaphor, the first kind of conceptual metaphor, which is the orientational metaphor, and then the container metaphor. For the changing the traditional maybe model name, I also asked at that time, but this is the name that was taken from many sources. And I have mentioned why they call it traditional. Also, I have very long sections about, as I said, definitions about the reasons why I select these phrasal verbs. And I remember also you asked me about the frequency. I depended on two familiar lists that list the phrasal verbs according to the frequency. I actually forget the name of the authors, but these two lists are the two lists that were taken from sources, from original sources. And the second way that I depend on taking the frequency was the dictionary. Because, you know, if you go to any dictionary that contains the phrasal verbs, they define the phrasal verbs according to the frequency. So number one is the most frequent, number two is less frequent, and number three, and etc. For example, for the phrasal verb turn in, I didn't take the frequent one, which means submit. I took the last one, which is to go to sleep or to go to bed, which I think honestly, at that time, I didn't know the meaning of the turn in, which means to go to bed or to sleep. The less frequent, yes, this is one of the points that I liked in my study, because all the previous studies depend on the frequent phrasal verbs, leaving the less frequent. For the students, the sample of the study, the intermediate level students, they were like, the institution was one of the Florida institution, one of the language institutes at that time. So I think they have limited English because they are intermediate, not advanced level students. And for the point of Germanic and non-Germanic language, I also explained this in more details in my dissertation. I mentioned that Germanic language, all the Germanic languages have phrasal verbs, while the other languages and also the Romance languages, in Romance languages phrasal verbs do not occur. So I also explain in more details. But as I told you, Dr. Alaa, this is a research which is part of the dissertation. So of course, I didn't mention all of these details. I just want to mention also the traditional model of presenting phrasal verbs mentioned that the particle does not carry any meaning of the phrasal verb, while as you see, the container metaphor confirmed that the particle does have a meaning in the phrasal verb, especially the particle in and out. And I think that's all. And thank you so much for your comments and suggestions, Dr. Alaa. I really appreciate that.
No, thank you so very, very much. You know, of course, as I mentioned, the scope of the paper, you know, it cannot cover everything. Yeah. And I was interested in the questions it raises, basically. And it's in that spirit that my comments were there. But thank you again very much. I would like to open the floors for the questions. And I have one question from the media, and the question is, what was the structure of the tests conducted in the study?
Again, Doctor, the structure?
What was the structure of the tests that were conducted in the study?
Yes. So the test consists of phrasal verbs. This is the first column. And the second column was the definitions of the phrasal verbs. So that was the structure of the test. I asked my students to match the phrasal verbs with their definitions or meanings. So all the tests are the same, exactly the same. Only the last one, because we added untaught phrasal verbs in order to see if the phrasal verbs can generalize to the untaught phrasal verbs. I didn't mention that because at that time that I submit my research, I didn't put this section. But yeah, we added 6 untaught phrasal verbs in order to see if there is a generalization.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Again, I invite the panelists to contribute with questions or comments or suggestions for future research that are relevant to the topic of this paper. That would be great. Okay, well, I would like to thank Dr. Majeed again very much for her excellent paper and for the depth of her thoughts that were presented both in the paper and in the presentation and in the discussion. And I would like to thank everybody else who attended and contributed to this session. And I invite everybody to move on to the other sessions of this conference, which I think you will find to be very interesting and intriguing. So thank you all, and I wish you a great day.